Nope, the recording did. All right, we're streaming now.
Great. Well, thank you to Will Brightbill, our district manager here at Community Board 8, and welcome everybody to CB8 Zooms, the monthly webinar on topics of interest to Community Board 8, which includes 59th Street to 96th Street on the east side from Central Park to the East River, and of course, beautiful Roosevelt Island. My name is Billy Freeland. I'm a member of Community Board 8, and I'm also co-chair of the Community Board's Budget and Sanitation Committees. Today, I'm substituting for our usual host, my sister Community Board member, Lori Borres, because full disclosure, today we will be speaking with Lori's son, Assembly Member Alex Borres. Alex was recently elected to represent the 73rd District in the New York State Assembly. I know Lori is very, very proud of her son, and just goes to show that in politics, it's all about who you know. If you're watching this live, a little bit later, you'll be able to ask questions of Assembly Member Borres, and the webinar will be available in a few days on the Community Board 8 website, which is CB8M, as in Mary, CB8M.com. It will also be on our YouTube page. And if you're watching live, you can ask questions by pressing on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many of them as possible. So welcome, Assembly Member Borres. Thanks so much for being here with us.
Thank you, Billy. It's great to be here.
So it's a real pleasure to speak to you today. You know, we've known each other for a few years in the community, but, you know, obviously now, as of January 1st, I believe, you are now a member of the New York State Assembly. So I think if we just get started, if you could share with our viewers, some of whom may be meeting you for the first time, why did you decide to get into politics and why run for the state assembly?
Yeah, absolutely. So welcome to all our viewers of this great program. I'm a longtime listener and longtime fan, and I'm sure that has nothing to do with the fact that my mom hosts it quite frequently. But my name's Alex Borres, new assembly member in the 73rd District. And as to why I ran, I'm born and raised in the area. I've spent almost my entire life on the Upper East Side, east side of Manhattan. And so this district is a lot of my neighbors, it's a lot of my friends, it's people I went to school with or their parents, were a lot of my early volunteers. And they don't think about Albany that frequently, but when they have in the past, they've thought about dysfunction, they've thought about ineffectiveness. They haven't seen it as a solution to really solve issues. And I've spent my career making government work better. So my career has been in government technology, building systems to make it more effective and efficient. And so when the opportunity arose to really do that close to home for a community that I love and have spent most of my life, I jumped at the opportunity.
And you've really hit the ground running, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But you know, for our viewers who maybe are familiar with the community board representing 59th to 96th Street, to be clear, your district overlaps with a Community Board 8, but also goes beyond it a little bit. So can you tell us a bit about your district, what not just the geographical boundaries are, but what are some of the issues and challenges that your voters, your constituents were telling you about on the campaign trail and are sharing with you to this day?
Absolutely. So I overlap with parts of Community Board 8, 5, and 6. So it goes from 32nd Street to 93rd Street, and then one little block on 94th. From 2nd or 3rd Avenue to 5th Avenue for most of the district, although in the 50s, it's the entire east side from 5th Avenue to the river. And so it's a district that largely follows the 6 train, is my easy way of describing it. Obviously, questions about the subway and about transportation are big, as was true in almost every election in New York in this past cycle. Public safety was one of the things that was brought up quite frequently. I describe my top 3 issues as public safety, housing, and the environment. But there's a lot that we have to do and a lot that I heard about during the race.
Yeah, that's all really key issues. And then, you know, one thing that you've kind of uniquely brought to politics in New York, at least, is your experience as somebody with a degree in computer science. My understanding is that you're the first Democrat elected at any level in New York with a degree in computer science. Can you share with us a little bit about how that has shaped your outlook on politics, but also how you hope that'll help you be effective in the legislature?
Absolutely. technology goes throughout all of these issues. So it's not going to be everything that I do, but there's a number of problems that if you utilize the best technology that's out there, or you just think about creative ways of solving it, you can get to much better solutions. So a couple of quick examples. Over the summer, the comptroller came out with an audit of New York's Medicaid system. And the government had contracted with a private developer to build a Medicaid system, which hadn't taken into account the fact that doctors might no longer be eligible in the future, right? Either because they stopped practicing or they didn't fulfill some requirement. That status just wasn't built into the system. No one noticed for 4 years, and it ended up costing taxpayers almost $1 billion in unauthorized payments that went out. So when we talk about efficiency, when we talk about finding revenue to do things, having someone that can ask technology questions can be relevant. The other one I bring up frequently is that New York City has many programs for people who are experiencing homelessness or attacking that. One pays for 25,000 vouchers for supportive housing. And on any given night, about 2,500 of those units are vacant, so 10%, which is almost enough, depending on the night, to house every street homeless person, right? So not everyone in a shelter, but everyone that's sleeping out on the street, depending on the night. That's about the amount that we have. And one of the main reasons why those units go unused is because the process of matching who's next on the list to the apartment that's available is still done by pen and paper. That's not advanced tech, but that's taking a approach of saying, hey, I actually care about the outcomes, the effectiveness, the efficiency of this that can lead to solutions. So it's another perspective that I'll bring. I often say I don't think every legislator should have a background in computer science, but I think one person in Albany should be thinking about how technology works and how government applies it.
Yeah, it really would be good to have at least one, and it's amazing that it's taken us this long. But that's a great answer, and I'm sure for many of our viewers, it's maybe the first time they've heard that fact. But that there's only now one, or maybe it's now two, I think, computer science degrees in the legislature. So let's start diving into the issues, and I'll start with the one that you've mentioned. I know here at Community Board 8, we have 3 top issues that we regularly identify. They're parks, they're schools, but then the top one is always housing. It's a perennial, it affects everybody. Homeowners have housing concerns related to property taxes, but so many of us, including myself, are renters, and the rent just, as they say, is too darn high. I'm not sure how much I'm allowed to curse on CB8 Zooms, but clearly a crisis. And the mayor is saying we're now a city of yes. The governor, I believe in her State of the State, called for, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's 800,000 new units of housing in the state. So how are we going to get there is, I guess, the big question. What are your thoughts on housing policy, and what can you do from your position? Is it about zoning? Is it about rental support? Is it about right to counsel? And how much of that gets done at the state level where you sit?
You said, is it about zoning, voucher support, rental support, and right to counsel? And the answer is yes, and a bunch of other things. There's a lot that we have to do to attack this problem. I think a key portion of it is, what can we do immediately? And looking at rental vouchers that help to supplement people's income so that the market can still clear is a key portion of that. Thinking about right to counsel, which we already have in New York City, but expanding that out to New York State, and also making sure that it's funded, because you can have the right, but then if you don't actually fund the lawyers being there, sometimes it's moving forward without it is key, and there's a bill to do just that. But we can't just solve it today. It's going to be a long-term problem, and in order to do that, we need to get more units online. The governor was correct in that we've created far more jobs than we have apartments over the past 5-10 years. And we've actually been behind many other municipalities in how we are bringing units online. And so that requires many approaches. Part of it will be office conversions, right? We have, now that's not a panacea. It's actually difficult to do with many office structures, but there are some that can be fairly easily converted to apartments for which we have a lot of demand, and away from office space for which demand has been suppressed, obviously, in the changes that we've seen in the last few years. It's also going to be about legalizing other apartments and units, so basement dwellings, accessory dwelling units. These are units that are kind of on the market, the black market in some ways, or they haven't been brought to market, and this would allow them to. It's about expanding zoning, especially around transit hubs. So where we can easily have people that would commute in on the LIRR or Metro North, or even out on the subway to come in. And it's about making the best use of the land that we have in order to house everyone. Because if we don't, that pressure on home prices and on rent will just continue to grow. And so there's many different aspects we need to look at. I'm very excited that the governor is focusing here. I'm not 100% in alignment with everything there, and I think there's pieces that are missing. For example, the vouchers was not mentioned in the State of the State. I know she has previously, but I'd love to see more of that included. But it's certainly going to be a big topic for all of us in Albany.
And my understanding is on zoning, for example, and so much of that obviously gets done at the city level, and those decisions will have to be made by the city council and the city planning commission. But the state level, the governor, at least last year, I believe still this year, wants to raise the cap on floor area ratio statewide. Do I have that right?
I forget if that was in the packet that she put out afterwards, but it's certainly a thing that has been talked about quite a bit. And so for those that are tuning in, by law, you in New York State, you can't have a building that has more than a 12 floor area ratio. So you look at the floor that the building is or the area that the building is taking up, and then you look at the square footage. That ratio can't be 12. So it's not a height limit. You can build a skinny, tall building, but that is a ratio that can't be broken if you were built after a certain time period. Now, there's lots of residential buildings that already violate this because they were built before it was put in. Many of the most famous buildings in New York would actually violate this and wouldn't be able to be built today. I think one thing that a lot of people are, and also one other bit on that is, if you were to get rid of that at the state level, and I don't know that there's a consensus around it, but if you were to get rid of it at the state level, that wouldn't immediately authorize the buildings. They would still go through the local land use process. And so it would still give local jurisdiction control over what happened. It would just not be Albany saying, hey, here's a rule that you cannot break under any conditions. Where there may be a consensus is around these conversions. So there's lots of office conversions that, because office buildings weren't subject to this rule, that could be converted, except they would be violating the FAR cap. And so you're not building a new building, you're not changing anything. You could bring apartments online. That feels like an easy use case where we can start to explore what could be different there.
That's a great explanation. And for those who are interested in zoning or didn't know they were signing up for discussion of the ins and outs of zoning, CB8 does have a zoning committee, which meets every month. You can see the schedule at cb8m.com, and I'm sure the chairs will thank me for plugging that. I'm so encouraged to see the questions already rolling in. And for those who joined late, please feel free to use the Q&A option at the bottom of your Zoom screen to ask a question of Assemblymember Borres, and we'll get to those in the second half of this discussion. But I want to turn to another key issue that you talked about, which is transportation. For those who don't know, you were recently appointed to your committees here in your freshman year in the Assembly, and one of those committees is the Committee on Corporations. Now, people may hear that and say, what is that about? Is that about private corporations? What's going on here? But it actually also deals with public corporations and nonprofits and entities like the MTA, which, as we know, controls the subways. And many people think, oh, the mayor's in charge. It's actually not. It's really the state level is where the real authority and oversight happens over the subways and the MTA. So it's very exciting for those of us strap hangers that you'll be on that committee. Can you talk a little bit about what that committee does with respect to transit oversight and any ideas you have or hearings you'd like to see happen to make sure that we see the improvements to our subways and buses here in New York City?
Yeah, there's not much I can add to your description, actually. You did a great job, but it oversees public authorities, including the MTA, including some of ones that you wouldn't think of in terms of transit or energy, perhaps. But the MTA is obviously the big one for New York City residents. And there's a lot of conversations about how to improve the MTA. It'll be a big topic of conversation, both because of the looming deficit that it has. It's projected to be, I think, $2.5 billion in missing funds in a year or two, as well as conversations about how it can be improved, which it desperately needs some improvement. There's a package of bills that are being talked about in order to try to fix the MTA, very much under that exact title. But one, you said, what hearings would I like? One thing in particular I always want to keep front of mind with the MTA is accessibility. This has been a long time struggle with the system where so few subway systems are fully accessible. Up on 86th Street, we still have the station where only one direction on the 6 is accessible. It's really creates just a separate system that we're long past where we should be. The American with Disabilities Act is over 30 years old at this point, and here we are with a subway system that's so behind. So I want to make sure that we're focusing our capital improvements on making sure that everyone can access the MTA, and I'll be asking a lot about that in any hearings with them.
Yeah, well, it's such a critical issue, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that as a community board with you, over the coming years. Not going away anytime soon. But let me just turn to your first speech in the assembly, which got some attention on social media. I thought was really excellent. But the topic was a constitutional amendment on equal protection to the state constitution. I believe our other Upper East Side Assemblymember CB8, is the prime sponsor on that in the assembly. Can you tell us what that amendment does, but also share for your viewers who may have missed it, a bit about your speech and how you invoked your own personal family history?
Absolutely. So first, I want to give a shout out to Assemblymember CB8, who has been championing this for years. And for those that don't know, a constitutional amendment actually has to pass the legislature, then there has to be an election, then it has to pass the legislature again, and then it goes out to voters. So she already passed it once through the legislature and led that fight. Then there was this election, so we did it again. And then next year in 2024, it'll be on the ballot for voters. So you'll be hearing a lot more about this. And I should also give a shout out to our Senator, Liz Krueger, who is a sponsor in the Senate for the same bill and pushing it forward. But the Equal Rights Amendment, the New York Equal Rights Amendment, is adding in a number of categories that are protected from discrimination, including gender expression, including sexual orientation, and including reproductive health services and pregnancy status. And so fairly explicitly putting a right to abortion, which exists in law in New York State, into the Constitution, so that it can never be overturned by any future state legislature or governor or aspect like that. And perhaps a small bit of context is that at the start of the session, the Assembly, the Senate, we tend to pass a lot of bills very quickly. And the reason for that is you'll have a bill that passes the year before, you'll have a negotiation with the governor over it. And sometimes the governor will say, hey, I'm going to sign this bill, but I want you to make this like small change to it. And the way that happens in New York is basically the governor signs it, and then the first session, you make that small change and you pass that as a new law. That's called a chapter amendment. And so both the Assembly and the Senate have been we've been churning through a lot of bills that are just not that controversial. We're dealing with things that happened in the past. And this was perhaps supposed to be one of those. It's already passed the legislature, right? We're going to pass it again. And so when I sat down, when we started debating, I wasn't planning on saying anything. And then the Republicans in the chamber started really attacking the bill for a whole number of different reasons. And then the speaker, like one or two before I actually stood up, went ahead and made some references about Democrats needing to find a Bible or something like that. And so I was inspired to just give up, to stand up and speak about that. And I referenced sort of the interpretation of the Bible at the start, but then I told a personal story, which is that my great-grandmother, her name's Mary Gigi, she died because abortion was illegal. It was 1943. She already had 3 children, including my grandmother, who was 7 at the time. She paid for an abortion. It went wrong. She started bleeding out, and she was too afraid of the law to actually go get health care. It devastated the family. Part that I didn't mention in the speech is that the siblings were then split up. And so that's how it's continued to affect my family to this day. But I thought it was just important to tell that story in that moment when we were voting, and to say her name in the chamber as we were passing this amendment into law.
Well, it was really powerful, and I recommend to anybody to check it out. I think the full speech is on your Assembly website, actually, and it's just about a minute, but you really pack in a minute a really few really critical and powerful moving points. Well, look, I have more questions for you, and I've got maybe some rapid fire at the end, but the questions from the audience are really coming in, and so I want to turn to them now. And as a reminder for everybody, if you do have a question for Assembly Member Boris, there's a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. But let me start. I'll try to do these. I might try to organize them if I can, but I'll start with the first question that came in, which is from Judy Schneider, member of Community Board 8. And Judy asks, where are you on redistricting? Will you be speaking out at the hearing?
Judy, thank you for this question. I really, really appreciate you bringing this up. So I know people have heard a lot about redistricting in the last few years, and hopefully this is the last one for the next decade. But the Assembly maps are being redrawn yet again. So the district that I described is as they stand now, but there are new proposed maps that are coming out. The New York Independent Redistricting Commission has proposed them, and they are taking public comment, and they're going around county by county. Manhattan's hearing is February 7th at Hunter College at 4 p.m., I believe, and you can register to give testimony at nyirc.gov. I highly recommend people do it. The map as drawn does a real disservice to the east side. It's similar to the first draft of the city council maps, where they take a part of the east side of Sutton Place, of Turtle Bay, and they move it into a new district with Roosevelt Island into a majority Queens district. Just about no one who lives in any of those areas supports this change. It would make it a very odd district to represent, as the needs are different, and all of the testimony that people gathered about the city council lines apply here too. So I would strongly encourage people to go to the hearing, to testify. The hearing is on a Tuesday when I will be in Albany. So I am working out whether I can testify from abroad or submit it separately. I would love to join in person. But I'm very much encouraging. I've put out a statement. I will probably do more, and I very much encourage everyone to look at the maps and to make their voices heard.
Great. And we also, from the audience, have a few questions on transit generally. Let me see if I can group them. So I'm not sure if I should anonymize this person, but I'll just go ahead and say your mother has a question. Lori Boris, also Community Board 8 colleague, asks, I love the Omni system, she says, as do I. Can anything be done to encourage the MTA to bring Omni to additional affiliate agencies like buses in the Bronx? I think that's a great question. We also have, outside your district, but in the 76, we have the Roosevelt Island tram, which ought to have Omni, and I think it's supposed to be happening at some point, but I don't actually know the status of that. So maybe I'll let that question sit on its own. Do you want to speak as a member of the Corporations Committee on Omni and the expansion of it?
Yeah, that's a very informed question from my mom. A lot of it comes down to these affiliate agreements. So it's long past time to have Omni at Roosevelt Island on the tram. That's been compounded by the fact that I think for the last 3 weeks, the MetroCard machines there have not been functioning and not been taking credit cards. So you need a physical MetroCard and the machines aren't working. I mean, it's a real disservice to residents of Roosevelt Island. But part of it is affiliate agreements, right? So the MTA strikes an agreement with the Roosevelt Island Operating Corporation, and that sort of has to be negotiated. There's a similar conversation going on, I believe, with buses in Westchester to maybe bring them on to it. I'll be doing everything I can to encourage those conversations to move quickly, because having one system that everyone is using just makes it so much easier to get around our city.
And I may have actually misspoken, because while Roosevelt Island's not in your district, the Manhattan side of the tramway, I believe is.
Absolutely, and, yes.
I'm a frequent user of that tram, so it's a great question, Lori. And I don't just say that because you're Alex's mom and my colleague. But let me stick with transit, and we have another question about MTA signaling and the signal system. And you probably can go through this history a bit, but I would encourage anybody to just Google New York Times subway signals and read these great stories about how our signal system dates back to, I don't know, the 20s or 30s, and it's so outdated and so much manual effort goes into them. And when you have a more up-to-date signaling system, I think it's called computer-based transmission. Well, I'll leave it to the computer scientists here, but that actually, and it exists on the L train, helps you run more trains more frequently. So that's the signaling system in a nutshell. And this questionnaire asks, 30 years ago, the target for the MTA was updating the signal system. Signal money always gets used someplace else. Will you work on getting the subway signals updated?
100%. And I love this question. And it's quite overdue. And in fact, my data is a few months old here, so someone can update me if I'm getting this wrong. But the MTA was planning to finally do the 6 train, I believe in 2024, 2025, but it was putting it below, some of the other trains, whereas the 4, 5, 6 is one of, if not the most congested lines in the city during rush hour. And so the modern signals, as you pointed out, some of the signaling technology in the MTA is over 100 years old. And modern signals would allow you to safely run more trains on a track, because the trains can talk to each other, can stop each other. You know exactly where the trains are. That allows you to have more capacity, which makes rush hour much better, which makes it a much smoother ride overall. We've known we've needed this technology for years, and it keeps getting pushed back, and we absolutely need to prioritize getting it done. And so I'll be pushing very much to, at the very least, hold the MTA to their current timeline, if it's not possible to bring it up and do it even quicker.
Great, terrific answer. And I'm sure we'll be also talking about that in the months to come, because it is such a critical issue here on the East Side. So let me ask this one from Jane Lindbergh. And, there's no question mark in it, so maybe it's more just a flagging issue for you, and it's one that I'm less familiar with. But Jane writes, as a grants writer for New York City not-for-profits, a close look at Grants Gateway would be welcome. It is a pretty clunky system that would benefit from improvement. Now, I know, Assembly Member, you, for example, helped get the Roosevelt Island tram that we were talking about on the Google Maps, literally. So you're pretty familiar with systems and improving the user experience. Are you familiar with Grants Gateway, or is it something you'd like to look into and maybe speak to Jane about?
Jane, I'll definitely be calling you up on the specifics there. But I will say that New York City has passed a bill, and the mayor has announced an initiative. And I believe it was our local city council member, Julie Menon, who proposed the bill, although if it wasn't, I'll give her credit anyway. But to make a one-stop shop for New York City services, where you have one website that could help you go through all of this. And I'm looking at ways to do that at the state level as well. I mean, certainly having clunky government websites benefits no one. And the more that we can make government accessible and easy to use and simplify the process, it's not just good for residents, it's how we actually live up to the intentions of bills. And one of the motivating things for me is that the success is not when a bill is signed. The success is when the people see the benefit, when New Yorkers' lives are actually improved. And that means watching it all the way through implementation, which means having working websites, having it be easy to use, having it simple where people know where they can find things. So I'd love to talk about the specific example, but I would say broadly, absolutely, it's one of the things that I'm focused on for the state.
Let me now maybe turn to an issue that is, I don't know if local is the right word, because it's supposed to happen throughout the city, but it's these 5G towers that are proposed to essentially, as I understand it, replace the Link NYC towers, but and provide 5G broadband service through the city. Lo Vanderwalk has a question on this, and Lo is runs the Carnegie Hill Neighbors and is a frequent attendee of our community board meetings. I know has been at meetings where we as a board have taken up this issue. So Lo asks whether you could comment on the 5G towers, and then he asks specifically, are there alternatives that are less obtrusive, even if lower overall capacity? So Assembly Member, maybe you can just explain for our viewers what the issue is, and then respond to Lo's question.
Absolutely. So the short answer is yes. there are less intrusive and obtrusive areas ways to provide this capacity. And I want to commend Lo for his advocacy on this issue, in fact, along with many. But let me take a step back and just walk through this technology quickly. And if I get too wonky, Billy, pull me up. But I'll try to do this.
No, get wonky. We're here to get wonky. I don't believe in
Wonderful.
shirking our wonky duties. Yeah.
I love it. So 5G technology is the next level of signal technology, which is extremely fast. It is much faster than Wi-Fi. Although you have to realize that there's two kinds of 5G. There's one that's just barely faster than 4G. We're putting that aside. For now, when I refer to 5G, I'm talking about the fastest one. That's what most people mean, the ultra wideband 5G. It's very, very fast, but it only goes short distances. And it's actually pretty poor at passing through buildings or other obstructions. And so you can provide a massive amount of bandwidth, but you need to have many different towers, many different cells in order to actually provide this technology. Now, what does that mean for this specific proposal? Well, it means that 5G can be faster than your home internet. And one of the reasons there's so much interest in this is telecom companies think and are planning on 5G replacing all of the cables that are currently providing internet. And they will just use 5G, not just for your cell phone, but for your home Wi-Fi. That it'll go from your router right to a pole and out. And so there's a big interest in building up this capacity. So the question is, okay, if there's this capacity and it can be this beneficial in the future, how do we do it? How do we provide a lot of these small cells? One way to do it would be to do the same thing we've done with 4G, where you negotiate with individual buildings and you put small cells on the buildings. Another way, which New York City has already rolled out, is to put much smaller cells on top of existing infrastructure. So you can see single cell 5G aspects on top of existing streetlights often. I believe there's one on 85th between 1st and 2nd already that's much smaller than what's been proposed with the Link 5G. There's also proposals to put it on top of traffic lights, which the telecom companies prefer because it's unobstructed in 4 directions, right? And 5G doesn't go through buildings well. And so if you put it on the corner, you can actually reach more. A third way to do it would be these Link NYC towers. And in order to do it, you'd need a lot of them, and you need them everywhere, right? So some of the conversation around these 5G towers has been, oh, you know, people are saying don't do it locally, but they still want the benefits of it. The 5G from the towers only goes for about 2 blocks. So it's not that, you know, you place it in one neighborhood instead of the other. You actually need them in every neighborhood in order to get any benefit from them. And the 5G towers, the reason Link NYC is pushing it so much is that program has actually been in financial distress. Link NYC was supposed to produce a profit for the city and supposed to provide Wi-Fi, and it ended up almost bankrupt in 2020 and 2021. And so they amended it and said, okay, advertising revenue isn't paying for it. We'll also give you the ability to sell 5G capacity to your Verizons, your AT&Ts, your telecoms, or smaller providers. And so there's a real incentive from the city perspective to get these up and to sell it. But I think it's leading to a subpar solution in terms of coverage and in terms of the aesthetics of it. So this is not a, anti-5G generally. This is not a anti that, but it's saying that this solution might be motivated more by financial concerns of the city and some of the deals that were made in the past versus what's actually best for coverage now and best for the neighborhood. So I'm engaging with the Landmarks Preservation Commission. I'm engaging with New York City and the DOIT for if there are better ways to present this, because we can't say, oh, coverage is good. This is thinking about what internet coverage looks like in the future. And New Yorkers are not going to stop using Netflix and not going to stop streaming, right? We need to have the bandwidth grow, but I think there's much better ways to do it than the current plan.
And just because an acronym was dropped, DOIT, Department of Information Technology, do I have that right?
Yeah.
Also exactly. Known as Do It. Do they call it Do It?
Exactly.
They call it Do It. Well, look, we have time left, but we also have audience questions left. So I'm going to get to as many as I can. And I do want to thank everyone who's participated. I apologize if we don't get to your questions, but I know for a fact that the assembly member is extremely reachable and his office is very responsive, which is great. You always want that in your elected officials. But let me go to a question here from Boaz Galil, because we talked about it earlier, but Boaz asked specifically, what about an increase in housing units in the Upper East Side? So we talked about housing earlier for those who may have missed it, but any specific plans for what we can do to actually increase the number of units on the East Side? And I'll add my own kind of editorializing, which is the city, I believe, and I have their mug with me right here, but they had an article that was talking about why we aren't increasing the housing supply. And in neighborhoods like ours, we're actually seeing a lot of apartment combinations. So even if you see a lot of development going up in the community, on net, you don't get that many units. Sometimes you get even fewer units because of apartments being combined. So with that, putting that aside, to Boaz's question, how about additional housing units in the Upper East Side?
Yeah, we need them here too, not just on that. And so, the office conversion, it might not be Upper East Side, but Midtown East and nearby where a lot of the offices are is definitely a part of that conversation. But even in terms of building new ones, we saw 2 new developments just outside of my district, but in the Upper East Side generally, where they knocked down a number of older buildings and they're putting up one new building that has fewer apartments than the sum that they knocked down to do it. And that's completely unacceptable. So people are right to be skeptical of new developments that are not returning more housing, but we also need to find ways to get the developments that are producing new housing everywhere in the city, everywhere in the state, not just along the LIRR.
Great. So we have a question on transit and a question on schools. Let's start with the transit question. So Evan Z. Booker asks about transit. He says, since the controversial congestion pricing plan, and I'm quoting Evan here, since the controversial congestion pricing plan relies heavily on public transit, would you act to encourage all public officials and MTA executives to take public transit at all times and for all purposes, and give up their government and personal cars so they would understand the safety and reliability challenges average New Yorkers face every day? Evan adds that in a true emergency, the mayor and governor could ride in a police car. So, okay, this is, an interesting idea. I think it's an idea that we've heard sometimes before, that public officials shouldn't, have basically a government car, but also that public officials should lead by example. People wanted this, for example, in our current mayor, and to some degree, we've seen him on public transit regularly. So, Assembly member, what do you think about that? How do we encourage public officials to use public transit? Any other thoughts on Evan's question?
Absolutely. So Evan, we've talked about this a little before. It's a great question. I'll start by saying I don't have a government car. I didn't accept the government placard. I ride the subway whenever I can. And so I do think that elected officials should lead by example, and certainly they should be knowledgeable and lived experience in what they're talking about, right? You don't want an elected official that is never on the subway and doesn't see what New Yorkers are seeing every day. A full-on ban on elected officials taking a cab, I might sort of limit perhaps the opportunity to meet with as many groups as they do or to engage in that way, and might actually get in the way of doing their job. But I think in the end, voters can hold elected officials accountable. If you always think an elected official is not participating in the right way, like, you should call that out. But I personally, I try to take the subway whenever I can. I don't, I take the train up to Albany. I don't drive. I see what's going on in the subway every day, and I'd encourage all of my fellow elected officials to do the same.
Well, thank you, Evan, for the question. We'll turn also now to a question on schools. This is from Amy Schwartz. Amy writes, New York City public schools are funded through state fair student funding. There is concern that the formula that determines how the funds are allocated, which was introduced in 2007, does not accurately cover the full needs of New York City students, such as the increase in students experiencing homelessness. Will you support efforts to update and revise the formula?
Absolutely. So I think, I don't want to promise, I don't have control over it, but if I can prognosticate here, I think in this budget will be the one where we will fully get the foundation aid page in New York City schools, which would be a very exciting thing, since that is a controversy that has gone back to the 90s of not sufficiently providing the state aid that is required. And so that is one piece of funding for the schools that we'll be trying to address from the state level. I think there's also, as you point out, concerns about whether the schools are getting the right funding given their population and given the additional challenges that can come. It's not linear to enrollment. It depends on what your population is. It depends on the size of the school. It depends on a lot of other aspects. So open to any sort of improvements there. It's cliche to say that education is our future and how many problems are solved that way, but it's important for elected officials to remember that and always be focused on how we can improve the schools. I'm a product of them myself. I went to all New York City public schools, and I'm laser focused on making sure that every student gets as phenomenal an experience as I had.
Great. Let's jump now to a question from Todd Stein. Todd writes, buildings seem to be under construction all over the city. They cover up the streets, all over the streets. He mentions the one on my corner was a Trump building, but they removed the Trump name. This construction has been up for many years, Todd writes. It's been so many years, and there isn't any sort of limit on the time that they stay up. It creates such darkness, he writes, ... almost bringing the darkness into the prose of the question, which I enjoy, Todd. But, let me just put a question mark on it, which is, what can we do about, the construction, the number of buildings that are popping up, just in terms of how long these construction sites, I think is the thrust of the question, are allowed to sort of remain as they are with the scaffolding and, the famous kind of green wall that says post no bills. I mean, any thoughts on the questions Todd's raising just about the years and years of seemingly endless construction?
Totally. There's a lot that we can do to improve it, and it's a great question. One of the problems is that the cost of putting it up and taking it down is a very substantial portion of that cost. And so any delays, it's just cheaper to leave it up often. But there's a number of things we have to target. The first is reducing the delays it actually takes to do these projects. So making sure that city agencies and state agencies are responding quickly and are allowing fast amendments. I've heard from so many people that have tried to do a project where they say, I come and I present a plan and the city says, oh, actually this one thing is wrong. And I'm like, okay, cool, I'll change it. And they're like, no, you have to make another appointment and show us the plans in 2 months. I mean, we got to find ways to speed it up so that it doesn't stay there. And then for those that, I don't know how many people watched the State of the City yesterday, but Mayor Adams put out a proposal for a new form of scaffolding that allows more light in and regulations around that would provide it to have a more airy feel and fit in more with the neighborhood. I haven't seen the details besides the rendering that the mayor put up yesterday, but I'm interested to hear more about that and what we can change there.
Great. Let me now turn to a question from Yael Jacobian. Yael writes, or Yael, rather, I believe, writes, ballot initiatives can be difficult for even the most educated and active voters to understand. Will you and your colleagues who supported the New York Equal Rights Amendment, which we were speaking about earlier, be able to promote voting for this bill and share with constituents the implications for voting yes or no?
Great question. And we've seen really good ballot initiatives and really good amendments fail even in the last few years. There were a number on elections because there was no sort of money or advocacy or information put behind the value of the passage. So absolutely, we will be talking about this a lot as 2024 comes. I don't think this is a controversial one for New York State, although that has been said before, and so we'll take nothing for granted and really be advocating for this. And we'll probably ask for many informed citizens and activists and those who are involved to make sure they're spreading the message as well. Because you're right, ballot initiatives people sometimes don't think about until they're right there in the voting booth and they see it. And so it's important that we tell people about each of these amendments and why they're so important when they're proposed.
Great. So I think we've got time for a couple more quick questions from the audience. And then I've got one last question for you before we close out. But So, and these are anonymous attendees now asking the question. One asks about basically about your relationship with Speaker Hasty, and your ability to convince him, if it requires even convincing, to share the concern that you have for your constituents with him. So I put it another way, what is it like working with the Speaker of the Assembly to talk about the issues we've been talking about today? How do you share your concern with him, and how do you make sure it's a priority for the Speaker?
It's an ongoing open dialogue, and I will give the Speaker a lot of credit for making sure he's listening to every member. He has 150 members in the Assembly, 102 Democrats. All of our districts are different. What our residents want are different. And he's trying to balance all of those concerns throughout the state, while then also thinking about the institution of the Assembly and what we do with respect to the Senate and the governor. So there's many moving pieces, and I found him to be someone who listens very, very well, and may not always, be the first out of the gate on saying certain things or proclaiming it. And that's because he wants to make sure there is consensus and agreement within the caucus and between it. And just because of the position that he's in, he can't always be kind of the first on certain issues. But that's because he's balancing an entire caucus and doing it very, I think, largely effectively. I've seen, even in the 3 weeks that I've been there, almost 4 weeks, a number of issues where we had to survey everyone who was in the Assembly, think about what the best path forward would be. And he does take input from all of us. So that doesn't mean you always get your way, of course, but I can assure people that he is listening to all of the members. And so if your members are advocating the way I'm trying to advocate, you're getting heard there. And I will make sure that, as much as possible, it's not just getting heard, but that action is taken as well.
And one more audience question for you, Assembly member. So anonymous attendee asks, what other committees are you on? We spoke about corporations, but maybe you can speak about your other committees. And then I love this question. Have you found a favorite place to eat in Albany?
No, I have not. And I would love suggestions for that. We've been up there a lot, but been a lot of running around and sort of eating right in the Capitol. So I think I've been to 2 or 3 restaurants in the 4 weeks there. So if people have Albany suggestions, I'm very much looking for them. Most people serve on 5 committees. So I have the Corporations Committee, which, as we talked about, oversees the MTA. I have Consumer Affairs and Protection, which touches a wide variety of things. I'm particularly interested in sort of the digital privacy side of that we'll be dealing with. The Insurance Committee, which most of insurance in the US is regulated at the state level. And New York has an extremely robust insurance industry based on some regulations that were passed a while ago requiring audits, but that made our insurance industry quite strong. And so I'm excited to engage there. Drug abuse and alcoholism, which we're continuing to see rises in challenges from fentanyl and from that we'll be addressing in that committee. And finally, the Science and Technology Committee, befitting my background as the first computer scientist in New York, really excited for ways that we can work on government improving things or just how technology is used broadly.
Great. So my last question for you is maybe a 3-parter, rapid fire of sorts. Favorite place to eat in the district?
Ooh, favorite place at all to eat in the district. That's tough. I don't want to rule out some very, this is one of those you name one and people get offended by the rest of them. Come back to me on that one. I'll give you one. I won't dodge it, but I just want to think about it. Give me the other.
No, yeah, that's respectable. Well, the next one's almost related, which is, do you have a favorite bagel spot in the district? And if not in the district, I'll let you get away with Manhattan.
No. I'll tell you, my favorite bagel spot right now is Bagel Express, right around the corner from the office. They have a surprisingly good coffee and really solid bagels, and it's on the block. So I've been a frequent shopper at Bagel Express.
Yeah. And then the last of these questions is, what's your favorite book that you've read, ideally recently, but could be less than recently, that you'd recommend to the folks listening today?
It depends on sort of what you're interested in learning, and I think that books really can match your time and where you are and focused on things. So I read about a year ago, I read Master of the Senate, Robert Caro's third book on Lyndon Johnson, because Stacey Abrams said that it was the book to understand legislative operations and power and how to get things done. And so, I found that to be instructive. I found pieces to be cautionary. Anything by Robert Caro is fantastic. I think certain New York City politicos have maybe ruined this phrase for the rest of us, but David Allen's treatise, Getting Things Done, which he came out with a new version with, I am rereading now as I sort through kind of all of the inbound of being an elected official and making sure I'm responding to every constituent that comes in and building those systems. I've been rereading that to really address it well. I'm always looking for suggestions on where I can learn things to serve better. So I'd also love any book recommendations that people have.
All right. Well, you heard it, folks. Send your book recommendations to the Assembly member. How can folks contact you? Where would they find your office?
Yeah, so we're still in Dancourt's office. So anyone who's visited there, you can reach us there, and same phone number as well. But the office is 353 Lexington. It's actually, the entrance is on 40th Street, just off of Lexington, between Lex and 3rd. And we're on the 7th floor, suite 704. You can pop in anytime. Often the easiest way to reach me is by email. So my Assembly email, I actually check myself. Is Boris, B-O-R-E-S-A. So it's the last name and then first initial, Boris A at nyassembly.gov. And that's usually the easiest way to get a hold of me.
Great. And do you want to say anything in conclusion as we wrap up?
No, I just want to thank everyone for asking these questions, for participating. One of my themes is trying to bring government closer to everyone, even when I'm up in Albany, right? There are daily concerns that we're thinking about. And while most of the news will think about really big issues, which we're all working on and take time and take consensus, there's sometimes like smaller local issues that you don't even think, hey, how could Albany help, or how could the state help, that we as elected officials love to work on. And so there's no problem too big. There's no problem too small. Please get involved, get engaged, contact the office. Would love to work with anyone who has an interest in making New York State and New York City better.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Assembly Member Alex Boras of the 73rd Assembly District, for joining us today. I also want to thank the great staff of Community Board 8, our District Manager, Will Brightbill, and our Assistant District Manager, Saida Harrigan, for pulling this event together technologically, getting our flyer going. Really, exceptional staff on the Community Board. For our viewers, first, thanks to everyone who joined and asked a question. I think it speaks volumes about how engaged this community is on local issues. And if you missed any part of today's chat, CB8 Zooms can be seen in a few days on YouTube, Facebook, or the CB8 website, which is cb8m.com, cb8m as in Mary.com. We'll have another one of these sessions coming up soon. You can find our schedule also on cb8m.com. In the meantime, wishing everybody a really great weekend. And thanks again for joining us. Take care.